So we continue our series on love is. So we started out with love is patient, love is kind, and then we went to the first negative, love does not envy, okay? And then today we move on to love does not boast, love is not arrogant. Now this is, I guess much of what is in the Bible, if not all of it, is very, very countercultural. And we've referred to that and sort of talked about that quite a few times so far. That the way that Jesus lived his life and the way that God calls us to live our lives through Christ, through the teachings of Paul and Peter and other writers, is very, very countercultural. And here's a bit of an example of how countercultural the idea of not boasting, of not being proud, of not being arrogant is. Bonnie Marcus, in her book, The Politics of Promotion, I think that this just beautifully sums up exactly what love is not. Self-promotion is a leadership and political skill that is critical to master in order to navigate the realities of the workplace and position yourself for success. If you don't promote yourself, who will? Now, at times we can read that, and if we're thinking in a business mindset, if we're thinking in a career mindset, that seems to make logical sense. And it does make logical sense in the world that we live in. But unfortunately, quite often, the world that we live in infiltrates our world, infiltrates our mind, and infiltrates our faith. And then we live one way in the world, and we live another way when we're at church, or when we're at life group, or when we're at home. Charles Spurgeon, a very famous English preacher and evangelist, said this: revenge, lust, ambition, pride, and self-will are too often exalted as the gods of man's idolatry, while holiness, peace, contentment, and humility are viewed as unworthy of a serious thought. Two very, very contrasting statements. Be proud, pump yourself up, because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. And if you want to be a success, then you've got to be able to pump yourself up. You've got to be able to promote yourself. You've got to be arrogant. Whereas Charles Spurgeon says, these are things that we value in our world today, but why don't we value things like peace, and humility, contentment, holiness? So we come to 1 Corinthians 13:4 again. We're not moving very quickly through this passage, are we? We're still stuck in verse 4. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, love is not arrogant. Now, there are multiple ways to translate this, and I've given you a few little examples of different ways in which the English Bibles translate it. So some translate it as love does not boast. Love does not brag, the New American Standard Bible says. The New King James and the King James says love does not parade itself. It's quite a pictorial image there. Love does not parade itself out in front of others. The literal definition of this term means to vaunt one's self. Okay? The Greek word, as you've got it up there probably, it's a bit of a difficult one to pronounce. Perpeuomai. Okay, don't worry, there will not be a test on this. Okay, so again, it be lots of Greek words. There can be a real breadth of meaning to the one word, and that's why you get a lot of preachers who will talk about the Greek and they'll say, well, this is sort of where it comes from and this is why it's important, because quite often there is a real breadth of meaning in there, and there can be different interpretations of it. But to boast, to brag, or to parade oneself all have very, very similar meaning. To put it in modern terms, in terms that maybe we might be familiar with, is to be a braggart, to be a windbag, always going on about yourself, always talking about yourself. Oh, look, that's enough about me talking about myself. How about you talk about me? We hear that and we laugh and we chuckle, but unfortunately, we can probably all think of people that we know that might be a little bit like that. And we're not going to name any names. Gordon Fee, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 13, says that this term suggests self-centered actions in which there is an inordinate desire to call attention to one's self. So love does not brag. Love is not motivated by this inordinate desire to bring attention to one's self. To say, here am I, look at me. Now, interestingly, Paul here is most likely using this term specifically for the Corinthian community, specifically because of issues that were going on there. Now, that seems to make a lot of sense because it's what we've called an occasional document. He's writing to the church. This is probably his second letter that he's written. It should probably be called 2 Corinthians, and then 2 Corinthians should probably be called 3 Corinthians, because it is fairly unanimously believed by scholars that there is a first letter that we don't have any record of. And Paul refers to this letter multiple times in 1 Corinthians. Talks about when I wrote to you previously. So there is this ongoing argument between Paul and the Corinthians. And it's over many different things, but one of the key things that Paul is arguing with them about is that they've called Paul's authority into question. And they don't really want to follow him anymore. They want to follow some other teaching from someone called that we know as Apollos. Now, Paul doesn't say that it's Apollos' fault, and we don't really know exactly what Apollos' teaching was. But for some reason, the Corinthian church liked what Apollos was talking about. They took something out of what he was talking about, started to feed that into their faith, and develop a Christianity that Paul believed no longer represented the true gospel. But they didn't see it that way. And there are three key terms in 1 Corinthians that Paul talks about in a sarcastic way or an ironic manner in referring to the Corinthians. And they are wisdom, knowledge, and being spiritual. So they thought that they were wiser than Paul, that they were more knowledgeable than Paul, and that they were more spiritual than Paul. And so he's writing to them to say, you think you're so spiritual, and you think you're so smart, and you think that you're so knowledgeable. But I want to tell you, and I can show you from your actions, I can show you from your thoughts, and I can show you from the gospel why that is actually not true. And so 1 Corinthians 13 has to be seen in that context of what Paul, the argument, it is nothing short of an argument that he is having with the Corinthians. And he is basically saying to them, you are not loving. You think you are so spiritual. You think you are so wise. You think you are so smart, but you're not. And I'll show you why you're not, because this is what love is, and this is what love is, and you're not doing it. And this is what love is not, and that's exactly what you're doing. This is what scholars term the Corinthian problem. What was the problem in the church at Corinth? And this is the core of what that problem was. This belief that they were spiritual, that they knew better, that they were arrogant and proud, believing they didn't need to listen to Paul's gospel anymore, because they had attained a higher level of spirituality, a higher level of knowledge, and a higher level of wisdom than even the apostle himself. Jeremiah chapter 9, 23 to 24, I think that's right, says this, thus says the Lord, do not let the wise boast in their wisdom. Okay, the Corinthians are in trouble. Do not let the mighty boast in their might. Do not let the wealthy boast in their wealth, but let those who boast, boast in this, that they understand and know me, that I am the Lord. I act with steadfast love, justice and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, says the Lord. In Galatians 6, verses 13 to 15, even the circumcised do not themselves obey the law, but they want you to be circumcised so that they may boast about your flesh. May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me and I to the world. For neither circumcision nor uncircumcision is anything, but a new creation is everything. In the first passage in Jeremiah, we see that God saying that you don't boast in all of these other things, but just boast in your knowledge of me. Like desire to know me and desire righteousness, desire justice. These are the things that we should be seeking after. And then Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, has this real problem with the circumcision party that is going around and telling people who are not Jews and that have come to Christ that they also need to be circumcised. But then Paul points out, it's not because of any spiritual reason that they actually want you to become circumcised. It's so that they can boast and say, look how many people I got circumcised. It's sort of like some evangelists who say, look how many people I've led to the Lord. Look how many people I've influenced in this manner. It's great when people come to know Christ. But sometimes we do damage when we boast about how important we were in that situation. And that is what Paul addresses in Galatians with the circumcision party. In Paul's opinion, it is not possible to boast and love at the same time. Because one action wants others to think more highly of you, and the other action doesn't care about what people think of me, but it cares about the community as a whole. It cares about others. It's selfless. So Paul uses this term of boasting to say to the Corinthians, if you are thinking about yourself, even if you are saying that you are spiritual, but you are saying it so that people will look at you and say, oh, how spiritual and how wise you are, then you're not acting out of love and you don't understand what love truly is. Now, we're not talking about romantic love here, remember. We're talking about the love that God has shed in our hearts, a love that is selfless, that desires to serve, as we heard a little bit in our passage from John before. Then the second term that Paul uses is physio, okay, Greek term. And again, there are different translations that translate this in a different way. So there's a group that translated as love is not arrogant. Love is not proud. The New King James and the King James again gives this lovely pictorial image of love is not puffed up. Have you ever seen a puffer fish? Does anyone know what a puffer fish is? Puffer fishes aren't really good for anything, okay? But when they feel threatened, if you've ever caught one, if you ever go fishing and you catch a puffer fish, what is it? It looks like a normal fish if you see it swimming around. But once it gets caught and it gets fearful, it puffs itself up to become bigger than it actually is. But what is inside is just air. But it's a self-defense mechanism. It's a way of making itself look scarier than it actually is, bigger than it actually is, and it's a defense mechanism built into it. If you guys came together, you can sit together. It is okay. Sorry. So one of the reasons why the King James translates this as puffed up is because the literal translation of the Greek term does mean to inflate or to puff up. To inflate with pride, to inflate with vanity, to be proud, to be vain, to be arrogant. In Australia, you can possibly think of in your own context animals that do this. In Australia, we have something called the frill-necked lizard. And when you see it, it just looks like a normal lizard. But as soon as it is threatened, it goes, puts out this like peacock sort of thing, but it's skin. Why does it do it? To look bigger and scarier than it actually is. But it's all a ruse. It's not scary. Just like a pufferfish is not scary. But it's this self-defense mechanism. It's trying to make itself into something more, to appear that it is something more than it actually is. Now, interestingly, Paul is the only New Testament writer who uses this term. You can only find this word, this Greek term, used in Paul's writings. He uses it 7 times. And interestingly, and perhaps instructively, 6 times he uses in 1 Corinthians to refer to the Corinthians and in addressing issues that they are facing. So this tells us something more about the Corinthian problem. We've only got one author in the entire New Testament who uses this term, uses it 7 times, and 6 of them are in 1 Corinthians. And he uses it to describe them, especially in the context of their opposition to him. And he keeps referring back, quite often sarcastically and with irony, to the things that they are saying or that they think about him. Now, one of the things that they were struggling with, one of the beliefs that came out of their arrogance was something that was influenced by what we know as Hellenistic Dualism. Okay, can anyone tell us what Hellenistic Dualism is? Don't worry, I'll tell you what it is. But Hellenistic Dualism was this, it actually infiltrated a lot of religions of the time, and it was already a part of the Greek and the Roman pantheon of thinking. And a lot of the philosophers of the time, and even before Christ came, talked about this dualism, how the body and the spirit are two completely different realms. And one of the ways in which this played out in the Christian faith, and one of the ways in which it played out in the Corinthian world, was to believe that we are so spiritual and we live on this spiritual plane that we actually don't need to care about what we do with our bodies. It's not relevant. So Paul addresses immorality as one example. He lists a whole laundry list of sins, and a lot of those are sexual sins to the Corinthian church. So there seems to have been this sense of we are so spiritual. And think about 1 Corinthians 12, when he talks about spiritual gifts. There seems to be this sense of we're moving in these spiritual gifts, and we're speaking in tongues, and we're prophesying, and we're doing all of these other things. And Paul says, well, you're doing all of these things, and you think you're so spiritual, but you're still fornicating. You're still doing all of these other sinful things. You think you're so spiritual, but you misunderstand and you misinterpret. You can't say, I'm so spiritual, I don't need to worry about my corrupt body because my body is corrupt and it's going to die anyway. And Paul says, not so. Not so. So many in the Corinthian church had this exaggerated conception of themselves. An exaggerated conception of their wisdom, their knowledge, and their spirituality. They saw themselves firstly as superior to Paul, but also they saw their spiritual reality as being superior to their physical reality, and thus they did not apply the principles of love and the principles of the gospel to their physical life, to the physical realm of their lives. So that's a little bit on Corinthians. That's how Paul sees the Corinthians and the situation that's going there. But how do we see boastfulness and pride in action in our own lives? How do we see boastfulness and pride in action in our world today? Well, there are some very simple ways, like name dropping. Have anyone ever done that? You're talking to someone and you go, oh yes, I know so-and-so. You know? It's funny, I used to do that. I'll put my hand up. I have been guilty of this, particularly when I was younger. I used to go to the States quite often. I was a youth pastor when I was younger, and I used to go to the States quite often for training seminars and conferences and stuff like that. And I ended up becoming friends with a guy whose name is Mark. I'm not going to name drop, so I'll just use the first name. Mark he was involved in organizing a lot of these conferences. So he knew so many really, really famous people in the Christian world. And I had the opportunity through Mark to meet some of these people. And it was great. And a lot of them were really, really wonderful people. And then I would sort of go back to Hong Kong, or go back to my job, or go back to wherever, and people would be, saying, oh, I love that song, like it's great. And I'd be like, oh yeah, I've met Chris Tomlin. It's a great guy. Is that essential information that I give to people? There's this sense in name dropping of, if I say that I have some sort of association with this person, that some of their spirituality and some of the perception of their spirituality and how great they are might rub off on me, and people think, oh, Chris Tomlin, you're so spiritual. If he likes you, you must be super great. Let me just give you a few other names. No, I'm not going to give you any other names. But yeah, this was a real problem for me. And each time I did it, I would hear myself doing it right. It wasn't even later on I'd go, see, I shouldn't have done that. But sort of oh yes, I know Chris Tomlin, as that came off my lips, I would feel this conviction in my spirit of like, why did you need to say that? Like, what are you doing, Paul? I'm trying to puff myself up. So name dropping is one way in which we see boastfulness and pride in action. Another way we see it is taking credit for God's work. Oh, so-and-so has been doing really, really badly, and they've been off and they've struggled in their faith. But then I saw them last week and they're back going to church, and they said they're doing really, really well. Yeah, I met up with him last week and I prayed with him and talked to him and da-da-da-da-da. You know, oh, so it was you, you're wonderful, you're the one that's turned this person around from their way. Okay, another way in which we can be puffing ourselves up, taking credit for really what God is doing. Did you hear that so-and-so has come to know Christ? Yeah, I witnessed to him. Hey, isn't it God that brings the increase? Isn't it, you know, we water, we break up hard ground, we do these things, but God brings the increase. So we can take credit for what God has done. And that sort of relates a little bit to what we saw in Galatians chapter 6 before, where Paul says, you know, these people don't actually really care about you. They just want to be able to say, look how many people I caused to get circumcised. Look how many notches I've got on my Bible. Aren't I spiritual? Another way in which we see boastfulness and pride in action is trying to sound smarter than we really are in conversation. Now, I'm going to use one of my daughters and as an example here, and it's okay. She allows me to do this. But my second daughter, Mika, who is now 20 and in her last year of university, when she was younger, being the youngest child, she just desperately wanted to be respected and seen as not being a baby. So when we would have conversations, I'd be having an adult conversation with other people, Mika would be there like laughing away, oh, that's so funny. And then she'd be, you know, try to get involved in the conversation. And as is quite often the case when you're actually not as smart as you're making out to be, everybody else could work out that she wasn't that smart, that she was just a kid, you know, she was just a kid. But she was trying to puff herself up. She wanted to be loved. She wanted to be liked. She wanted to be respected. So she was trying to puff herself up, to boast of who she was. She is an absolutely wonderful kid. She's not a kid anymore. She's a wonderful adult, very intelligent, wonderful kid, and doesn't need to fake intelligence anymore. She's very good at it. Another way in which we show boastfulness and pride, and this is a really contemporary one. When you look at Facebook, when you look at Instagram, when you read people's blogs, when you listen to their podcasts, what do you usually see? Is it usually a warts and all of, look, this is how broken I am, this is how messed up I am? Generally not. We generally, on social media platforms, we curate the best image that we can think of that we want other people to see. And this can have incredibly and tragic circumstances. If you read the news to any great depth, you would have seen over recent years, you know, this YouTube influencer has committed suicide. This Instagram influencer has committed suicide. You know, in South Korea, there's just like a pandemic of movie stars, of K-pop stars, and so on and so forth that have been committing suicide. And when you read about why they're doing it, it's because they've had to curate this image of perfection to put out there to the world, because that's what their producers tell them that they have to do. You can't show weakness. You can't show that you have any flaws. It has to be perfection. And after a while, they just cannot handle it anymore. And then if some bit of truth comes out that they aren't perfect, God forbid, then what happens? They get trolled. They get absolutely destroyed by all of the other fans on Twitter, on Facebook or whatever. And then it's like my bubble has been burst, my puff up has been popped, and now people see me for who I really am, and I can't deal with that. And they take their own lives. Now, those are extreme situations. But unfortunately, much of what we see in social media today is a similar concept. It's like, I want to put out what is best. I want to put out an image that I want people to think of me. I want them to think that I'm happy. I want them to think that I'm successful. I want them to think that everything is okay in my life and that nothing is going wrong. And this is a form of pride, of boastfulness. So where does boasting and arrogance come from? There are many other things, many other examples that we could think of, and you can probably think of some in your own mind. But where does boasting and arrogance come from? It can come from many different places, but I just want to focus on two places or two motivations of where boastfulness and pride and arrogance and pride come from. And the first is a genuine misconception of one's own worth and contribution. Some people who are really arrogant and really pride genuinely believe their own spin. They genuinely believe that I am the best, that I am the smartest, that I am the greatest. We can probably think of some people in our own lives or in public life that speak like that or act like that. Samuel Butler, I think at 18th century, Ruth will correct me on this one, 18th or 19th century English poet, said the truest characters of ignorance are vanity and pride and arrogance. Sometimes those people who puff themselves up and they do genuinely believe that that is the truth, and that is ignorance. Leo Tolstoy, who some of you may have heard of, said an arrogant person considers himself perfect or herself. This is the chief harm of arrogance. It interferes with the person's main task in life, becoming a better person. See, if you think that you're great, if you think that you've got it all together, if you think that you are the greatest, how are you ever going to really be transformed and improve and become a better person? You don't need to, because you, in your mind, in your ignorance, you think you've already arrived. Excuse me. Over my years in ministry, I have found the tragic truth that often those people who think that they're the greatest, think that they're the most spiritual, and quite often are the most judgmental people towards others, are quite often hiding their own sin, their own weakness. And being a pufferfish, being puffed up, is a way just to hide that away. It doesn't work that way 100% of the time. But quite often, the most judgmental, the most arrogant, the most proud, inside are hurting and in pain. And their arrogance is a way to cover that. And that's sort of where the second point comes in, a second motivation or a second way in which, where boasting comes from. And that is a desire to project an exaggerated or false version of yourself out of fear. Like the pufferfish. The pufferfish is trying to protect itself, so it puffs itself up. It doesn't actually believe that it is that way, but it tries to protect its own existence. And the way that we see that, we don't get caught on a hook, or we don't get beaten up by the bigger fish. But the way that things that lead to us doing that sort of thing is the fear of insignificance, the fear of failure, or perhaps the fear of rejection. And as a result, we seek to project an image that is better than we really are. And that comes from this place of pain or need. And unfortunately, sometimes the church can provide a place for people to do that really, really well. Because maybe in our places at work, maybe in our position at work, or maybe in our homes, or maybe in our social circles, we don't feel that we amount to very much. But then when we go to church and we find that church is so embracing and then so encouraging and then so empowering, we put ourselves and get ourselves into those positions that we feel that we don't have in other places in life. And unfortunately, we can sometimes encourage that. And it's coming from a place of genuine brokenness or a place of genuine need. But it is not healthy if it is based upon pride or upon arrogance. So our arrogance, we need to be careful when we encounter people who we would determine or discern to be prideful, to be boastful, to be arrogant. Because sometimes, yes, they genuinely are that way and genuinely believe their own press releases. But often it's covering up something else. It's covering up a level of dislike of self, a sense of inferiority. But boasting, wherever boasting or arrogance or pride comes from, it is ultimately empty. and will not satisfy us. And why is that the case? Well, one is because when we puff ourselves up, when we boast, when we are filled with pride, it doesn't reflect the reality of who we truly are. And so even though we might be projecting that image out there, there's something inside of us that keeps eating away at us. Because we're basing our identity, we're basing our sense of worth, we're basing our sense of love, of being loved, on this image that we're putting out there. And it is a man-made image, not a God-made image. I've always believed, and I'm going to use some language here in the moment. I'm not going to swear, don't worry. But I'm going to use some language you might sort of think, oh, I never expected a pastor to use that phrase in church. I have believed for a very, very long time that what most of us really, really want in life is for other people to see us naked and to still love us. I'm not necessarily talking about physically naked, but that could be in there as well. But I think ultimately what we want is we want to be able to say, this is who I am, and have other people say, do you know what, I love you anyway. I know that from my own life, and I know that from experience in working with people in pastoral ministry for decades. We all puff up to a certain degree. We all curate an image to a certain degree. But all of us, without exception, really at base, at core, we want to be loved for who we really are. We don't want to have to play that game. But we fear that we won't be loved and we won't be accepted when people see us for who we really are. And then we fall into that trap of pride and of arrogance. But as I said, it ultimately doesn't satisfy because it's not based on reality. It's a man-made image, not a God-made image. It's self-focused. How can I bring either glory or attention or acceptance to myself? How can I be popular in this setting? How can I be respected and liked and loved and looked up to? And if we take that back to its core, it's idolatry, because we're making self-acceptance from people our idol, rather than acceptance from God. Therefore, we get back to what I said about Paul before. Pride and boasting are the enemy of love, simply because it's all about me. It's about me. So we're going to look very quickly at two examples of how we can come against pride. And what is the opposite of pride and arrogance? What do you think it would be? Just say out a word. Humility. That's usually what we think about when we think about the opposite of pride, the opposite of arrogance. So Paul, let's look at the example of Paul first of all. So Paul is talking to these people who don't think that he's good enough. He's talking to this Corinthian church who think that he's not spiritual enough, he's not knowledgeable enough. They've heard from a better teacher, from Apollos, who was a better preacher, who was a better rhetorician, and they think we're going to follow after this guy, or at least what we've interpreted of this guy. You're just this dirty tent maker who wouldn't accept our patronage. You wouldn't accept the financial support that we wanted to give to you. So, we're better than you, basically. And so what does Paul do in response to this? Does he say, well, you're wrong, I'm better than you, and I'm so smart, and I'm so great? You would think that that would be the right thing to do, as we saw in the quote by that lady at the beginning. You've got to promote yourself, because if you don't do it, no one else is going to do it. But we have three examples of what Paul says to them in trying to establish or to re-establish his authority with the Corinthian church. And the first is in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. Paul says this, "And when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or of wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. So Paul doesn't say, here, I'm going to come against all of your arguments for why I'm not really wise and why I'm not really spiritual. He doesn't come against it. He embraces it and says, yeah, because it's not about me, and I don't want it to be about me, and I don't want you to become dependent upon me. I want to point you to Jesus. I want to point you to God. And the only way to do that is for you to see my weakness, for you to see my fear, for you to see my limitations, because when you see my limitations, you'll realize the only reason that Paul can say those things, the only reason he can minister in that power is because of God. Not because of his education, not because of his upbringing, not because of how smart he is, because all of those things would distract from who God was. It's quite an interesting approach, isn't it? It's a very countercultural approach. I'm not going to come at you and tell you how smart I am. I'm going to admit, yeah, I'm weak. I mess up. I used to kill Christians for a living. I'm talking about Paul the Apostle here, not me. But what does Paul do? He becomes naked before them. He said, yeah, there you go. That's me. But you know what? It's not about me. It's about him. And the second time Paul uses this line of argument is in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 8 to 13. You are already filled, and he's using irony here, and you can't really see it quite so much in the English. You are already filled. You have already become rich. You have become kings without us. And indeed, I wish that you had become kings so that we also might reign with you. For I think God has exhibited us apostles last of all, as men condemned to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake. But you, again, here's the irony again, oh, but you're prudent in Christ. We are weak, but you're strong, Corinthians. You are distinguished, but we are without honor. To this present hour, we, again, Paul is talking about the apostles, we are both hungry and thirsty and poorly clothed, and we are roughly treated, and we are homeless, and we toil, working with our own hands. Remember, Paul was a tent maker. When we are reviled, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to reconcile or to conciliate. We have become as the scum of the world. Who here has ever seen Fight Club? Though I'm not promoting this movie. There's a character in the movie played by Brad Pitt, who's a very good-looking man, called Tyler Durden. And he has one line in the movie, which is exactly here from 1 Corinthians chapter 4. He says, we are the all-singing, all-dancing scum of the universe. As humans, that's what we are. If we look at it in a spiritual sense, if we compare ourselves to God, we are the all-singing, all-dancing scum of the universe. That's just reality. We are filled with sin. We are fallen. What does Paul tell us in Romans? That we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are the scum of the world, the dregs of all things, even until now. I think you get the point. Paul's not trying to do self-promotion. He's being quite sarcastic. You guys think you're so smart, and you think that we are so weak and so limited, and do you know what? You're right on one of those things. We are. But why? So that glory may come to God, and that we may not glory in our own flesh. So that is the example of Paul. I won't read the third passage from 1 Corinthians 15 because I think you get the point. But Paul is not puffing himself up. If anything, he's saying, he's popping the bubble and going, this is who I really am. I'm exactly what you say I am, so to speak. Because it's not about me, it's about God. Esperanza read to us from John chapter 13, the story of the washing of the disciples' feet. Now this story is told in, it's not only told in the Gospel of John. The other three Gospels tell it in a slightly different way, but they tell a similar story, and it's a story about power. And it's the sons of Zebedee, and in some Gospels, it's the sons themselves that come, that James and John come to Jesus and say, we want to sit with you in heaven. We want to sit with you in authority, your left hand and your right. And in one of the Gospels, it's the mother who comes and says, would you let my sons sit there? Now, in the three other Gospels, this incident is either at the Last Supper or right prior to before it happens. And John leaves that one out, and John gives us this example of humility. He gives an example of basically the sons of Zebedee didn't understand what true power was. They didn't understand what true authority was. They didn't understand what true acceptance or even true love or what it meant to be a leader, to be a love giver. And so Jesus teaches them about servanthood. And how does he teach them about servanthood? He washes their feet. The one person on earth who had every reason to say, bow down and worship me, said, I will get down and I'll wash your feet. And Peter wants to reject it, but Jesus says, no, you don't get it. You don't get it. I need to do this. And one of the reasons why I need to do this is because I need to set you an example of what it means to be a leader. I need to set you an example of what it means to be my disciple. I need to set an example to you of what it means to be Christ-like. It means to lay yourself down and to serve. There's an English proverb, an old English proverb that says, you can tell a real gentleman not by how he behaves towards his king, but how he behaves towards his servant. I'll say that again. You can tell a real gentleman not by the way he behaves towards his king, but by the way he performs, the way he treats his servant, how he behaves towards his servant. Love imitates the humility of our King in his behavior towards us. He humbled himself to serve us. He humbled himself to wash our feet. And he calls us to do the same thing. And Paul reminds the Corinthians, love is not puffed up, but love gets down and washes the dirty feet. If I took my shoes off right now and you washed my feet, you might find that a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe they might smell a little bit, but I can tell you that it'll be a lot better than washing the feet of people who've been wearing sandals out in the dirty streets of the ancient Near East all day. So Jesus didn't get down and take people's shoes and socks off. Well-bathed people. He got down and he took off dirty sandals with no socks. Maybe they hadn't bathed for a while, who knows? And he washed those smelly, dirty, grotty feet. And he says to us to do the same. So love does not boast. It's not proud or arrogant. Love is defined by the opposite, the antithesis of boasting and pride. Love is defined by humility. It is an essential element of love. In our pride, what we do is we dethrone God and we put ourselves up higher. And Paul says, and Jesus says, no, we come down. What does John the Baptist? I must decrease so that he must increase. This is love. This is godly love. I was going to talk to you about something called the Romans Road. Who's ever heard of the Romans Road? Anyone heard of the Romans Road? Feeling filled with pride and arrogance, feel like boasting a little bit, feel like just talking about or even just feeling content in just how superior you are. The Romans Road reminds us, and it's a group of scriptures from the book of Romans that reminds us of exactly who we are. Romans 3:10 says, there is no one righteous, no, not one. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And in Romans 6:23, and the wages of sin is death. So it gives us a picture of who we are. We are sinful. We are lost. We are undeserving of God's love. But Romans 5:8 tells us, but God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were still sinners, he died for us. When Brother John preached, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago. He asked this really great question. And I was watching his sermon on YouTube because I had to be looking after my son during the sermon. But he asked this really, really good question, and it fits in really well here. When did God start loving you? Was it when you got saved? Was it when you confessed and said, I believe that Jesus is Lord? And he went, oh, great, I like you now. I'm going to pour out my love upon you. While we were still sinners, he died for us. The Romans road is a way for us to feel great joy at our salvation. And it reminds us of our salvation. And it reminds us of how we come to know Christ. We confess with our mouth and believe in our hearts that he is Lord. But it also is a humbling reminder of that without him we are nothing. And that's why a lot of people find Christianity impossible to swallow. Because it says, I'm nothing without him. And the world tells us, no, you are enough. You've got it. You can do it. You can promote yourself. You can pump yourself up. You can do all of these things. You can do it. You are enough. In Hong Kong, there was this, I think it was L'Oreal, which is a French brand. For many years, their slogan was, because you're worth it. You're worth it. Lavish, lovely stuff on yourself. Why? Because you're worth it. And there is some elements of truth in there. God doesn't want us to always just be walking around going, oh, I'm horrible, I'm nothing. But he wants our identity to be based in him. To be based in what he has created us to be, not in what some cosmetic company or society is trying to tell us to be. Proverbs and James 4 tell us that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Saint Augustine said it was pride that changed angels into devils. It is humility that makes men as angels, or humanity as angels. So in conclusion, arrogance and pride are the enemies of love. Why? Because they are self-focused, when true love is others-focused. And that is a key thing throughout what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. What is that? It is showing patience towards others rather than driving our own agenda. Love is kind. Love expresses goodness and kindness towards others, regardless of our feelings towards them or regardless of whether it's going to be of any benefit to us or not. Love does not envy. And how is that expressed? Love wants the best for others and rejoices in their good fortune, is not jealous of it or envious of it. And so fourthly, as we've looked at today, love does not boast. It is not arrogant. Love is not wanting to exalt ourselves above others, but being true to who we are and true in who we are, seeking the benefit and blessing of others, seeking to serve others after the example of Christ. Let's bow our heads in prayer. Lord God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for these challenging words, but also these greatly encouraging words. Lord, help us to hear these words, to take them into our heart and to allow your Holy Spirit to teach us about love. But that as we learn about love, we would not be hearers only, but that we would be doers. Help us not to be boastful, not to be arrogant. Teach us what true Christ-like humility really is. And may our lives bring glory to you and demonstrate your love to others. in Jesus' name. Amen.